Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. We praise Allah Almighty, for He alone possesses the attributes of divinity. Only God Almighty has perfection in all things, above and beyond every creature. And we pray for blessings and peace upon His Prophet Muhammad and upon his family and followers. I'm glad that we have the opportunity tonight to gather together and study a little bit of the Quran, the book of Allah Ta'ala, and seek to enlighten ourselves and get deeper knowledge of Islam as we are gradually approaching the month of Ramadan, the month of the Quran. It becomes even more so. And I know that this lesson is a review for some people, but it's also new for many people out there. And so I hope that it'll be useful and beneficial for you and for all of us, inshallah ta'ala. So last week, we were in the second part of chapter 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, and we began with verse 8. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَقُولُ آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَبِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ وَمَا هُمْ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ. There are people, or among the people, are those who say, we do believe in God and the last day, while they do not truly believe. And those are the people called the Munafiqun, or hypocrites of Medina. So we talked a little bit last week about Al-Medina and the cause of why were these people a force in Medina? They had not been in Mecca. And so we, on the screen, I know you guys can't see it out there. It shows the Masjid Nabawi, which was made of clay, like adobe brick building. It was a large open air enclosed wall, and it had on the south side where people used to pray toward Jerusalem at the beginning of the Hijra. There was also another arcade on that side. And so when you would be facing south, facing toward the Qibla, on your left side would be doors, which would be entering into the apartments of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And his wives had different apartments. Behind there, they had a private enclosed courtyard area of those houses where they would do a lot of private family activities back there. So the doors of the house open up directly into the masjid, the place of prayer. The doors were wooden doors. They basically had blankets hanging in the doors. So there wasn't lots of privacy. People would go calling out to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam from outside the door. So kind of uncouth Bedouin people would come from the desert, and the Prophet, peace and blessing upon him, didn't have a doorman or a guard or anything like that. And so it was kind of annoying. And later in the Quran, it's referred to in more than one place, but in Surah Al-Hujurat, for example, it talks about how to have good respect, talk in a lower voice, and not yell at people when they're in their house to come out, be patient, and how to greet the Prophet, peace and blessing upon him, and other people. And so anyway, it was a very simple place that the Prophet ﷺ lived and worked the rest of his life, the next 10 years in Medina. Before the Prophet went to Medina, it was called Yathrib. And it had two main clans, Khazraj and Aus. And they were in constant feuds, bloodshed between them. And they had different Jewish clans who were allies who would make different alliances. So for example, one clan would join with Aus fighting against Khazraj, and another clan of Jewish tribes fighting on that side. So it was a bloody mess and it was chaotic. So there were people who were chiefs or respected figures in those tribes who could exploit that instability for purposes of making power centers around themselves. And in fact, those are what you would basically call these days warlords in every kind of chaotic situation, anarchy, civil war. People like that arise who can command others who have a strong personality, and they can use that to their advantage. And it's possible that some of those people had sincere motivations, but of course, as they say, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. One of those persons was Abdullah bin Ubay, who was one of the leaders of Khazraj. There wasn't one single leader, but he became really the most influential leader. And he had strong allies from different tribes, including Jewish tribes. And he ended up prevailing. Against disaster, he was saved by his allies on especially a very famous battle that took place. And before the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, arrived in Medina, it was arranged that he was eventually going to seize power as the king or ruler of Medina. So people wanted to make peace, and there were lots of negotiation. And so, and he may have had sincere motivations as well, but of course, part of that was love of power. And also for anyone in that position of being a king, there's a lot of arrogance, a lot of pride that comes with being basically a ruler and king over human beings. And especially if you can make peace and solve the people's problems and end the years of conflict, they treat you as a hero, then they overlook a lot of your, misdeeds and your corruption and that kind of thing. And so Abdullah bin Ubay was interrupted by the Hijra. The way the Hijra happened was that several groups from Medina went down to the pilgrimage in Mecca, and they heard about the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. There was a lot of Jewish influence in Medina, and they used to talk about the coming prophet. The reason they lived in those cities was they were expecting a prophet was going to come, and they were going to join with the prophet, and then they would defeat their enemies. And so when people heard about the Prophet Muhammad, that sounded a lot like those stories they heard. And some of them thought that he could solve a lot of the problems of the civil war going on and make peace among the clans. And they made an oath. They embraced his faith when they heard his message. They made an oath to him. They came back in the next year and they brought a lot of other people. And they also made an oath to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him. And then they invited him to come to Medina. He didn't come right away, but he waited for a revelation. But gradually his persecuted followers who had been killed and suffering for so long, for so many years, they started gradually migrating, so that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, was actually one of the latter people who left Mecca and went to Medina. And a lot of people, when he arrived, embraced the religion, including some local rabbis and Jewish leaders, and lots of leaders of both clans. So now that the two big Arab clans were Muslims, or a lot of them were Muslims, they saw that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, could be a neutral, fair arbiter between disputes. And whenever any dispute would break out, it could be over business or property or personal disputes in neighborhoods, and people are different ethnic groups, different religions, it tends to turn into a group situation. Mobs and violence can easily happen. And then when we have decades old or centuries old gripes anyway, they're renewed in these times of disputes. And so it's very dangerous. And when your city is divided, you're not safe in an environment like Arabia, which there was no central authority or police or army or government. And so if you were not united, you were in danger from attack. And so the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, didn't come to Medina demanding to be a leader or judge or king or something like that. But it was natural that people wanted him to be the judge between them in disputes, and they sought him out, and his judgment was fair, and he sought always to judge fairly no matter what tribe or race or class or religion. And of course, these are all referred to in the Quran specifically in specific incidents. And so Abdullah bin Ubay was actually one of the people who early on embraced Islam. But usually from the beginning, it appears that while he may have thought, because he also was influenced by his Jewish allies, who literally saved his life in one of the major battles, that monotheism, Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, belief in the prophets and the Torah and Moses, and here is a prophet of Arabia, that might appeal to people who may be in other ways skeptical. But very quickly, he became a leader behind the scenes in his own right, not letting go of any authority or imagined authority for himself. Now remember, he never was a king. He never was officially a ruler of any sort. These were only personalities, like in civil wars in different countries where there are these different so-called generals and warlords and commanders and whatever. And so he had no actual authority, just his personality and his feeling of entitlement. And so he worked a long time to undermine the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, and his standing among Khazraj, his own clan, as well as among the people of Yathrib in general, versus the outsiders who have migrated, the refugees from Medina. That's a natural weakness, that you have refugees who depend now on you for help in getting settled. Oh, we never need those foreigners who have migrated. What did they say? Oh, they're never the best ones among you. And so that is an easy one. And also gripes between Jews and Muslims and Arabs and Jews and people of other nationalities. And so it's very easy to exploit those divisions. And so he did that basically for the rest of his life. He died shortly before the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. The Prophet led his funeral prayer. He lived as a Muslim, outwardly at least, and he died there in that manner. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing upon him, did not fight and kill the munafiqun or the hypocrites. The Quran talks and exposes them and what they're doing. But as the Prophet said, peace and blessing be upon him, when people said, you should kill them, he said, I don't want people to say that Muhammad kills his own followers. So that is the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him. So that is one of the bases that in Islam, as a judge, you can't judge by your own knowledge of facts. You can only judge by the evidence that's presented to you in court. And so even if you know somebody is guilty as heck, you don't have the right to act against them. And so as Muslims, we judge people by their outward statements. We can't inspect the hearts and minds of people and decide who to us is sincere and real and who's a fake and a phony. And of course, there are always people who try to exploit that, but we can't be drawn into that. We have to give people the benefit of the doubt and take people at their word, unless they openly commit crimes or indecent acts openly and that are witnessed and become knowledge beyond dispute. But otherwise, we have to take people at their word. And that is why Medina was a stable place, despite the years of fitna. that took place, it remained stable because it was based on the rule of law and a presumption of innocence that could be exploited. And it's always exploited by political factions and militant factions in every community. They exploit our basic human rights. And of course, then the populace is always, let's take those basic human rights away. And once you take them away from one group, we're all in danger. So once we say, oh, those people are not true, they're not sincere Muslim, or they're not real Americans, or whatever you want to say, and we've deprived them of their rights, then who's next? There's no stopping it after that. And so we have to defend people's rights and their presumption of innocence.
Can I ask you real quick?
Yes, please, yes.
So currently we live in an environment of cancel culture.
Yeah.
Which you are being judged by the populace in some sense, and without ever going to court or without any real evidence.
Yeah. Cancel culture. I don't know if they can hear or not. So the question is about cancel culture and how it relates to this subject. It's kind of, there's obviously a relation there. Cancel culture, I hate it when people use terms like that because it's hard to define. And a lot of things that happen right now, we're in a society that's moving toward a greater sensitivity toward groups that have suffered discrimination in the past. And I believe that and support that. Of course, laws are about presumption of innocence and individual rights, not simply group rights and group punishment. And there's a fine line there. And so when on university campuses, it's kind of well known in some certain Ivy League campuses, especially, there's a movement of silencing critics who sometimes say things which are less than wise. I don't believe in canceling free speech, but I do believe in responsible speech. And we should, whether we're religious leaders or political leaders or educators, think carefully before we say things like the N-word to students, regardless if you're using it in what would have normally been considered an innocent way. It, as people will say, people call that a trigger. Even the word trigger now is controversial, but there are words that literally have killed people. And so we have to be sensitive. But as usual in American history, we go from one extreme to the other before we ever find a moderate place in the middle where most common sense is. So we go to the extreme of the right and the extreme of the left. And so I want to just, I know exactly what you're saying, and I think I'm sympathetic. But people in the right, not very many years ago, a few years ago, were all about cancel culture. They were all about boycotting publications and companies that didn't support their religious views and their social views. And now that it's kind of turned around against them, now they're complaining about cancel culture. But actually the right and left are both guilty of policing speech, but each one has their area they consider off limits to everybody else. They want their area to be respected, but they don't respect other people's boundaries. And I see that on the extremes of the right and left. I think that usually the Islamic position of wise moderation is long-term, is what is productive and to a stable society. Islam has things to say about freedom of speech, like don't curse the idols that they worship, because then they will turn around and curse God out of their ignorance. So obviously the Quran criticizes idolatry. That's an essential part of our belief, but we shouldn't take the symbols that are important to people in their faith or culture and attack them in an emotional way that promotes an emotional reaction on the part of those people. And so I think we have to have responsible speech. Young people in school always go to, just think of the 60s, and then the reaction to the 60s. The hippies of the 60s became the yuppies of the 80s, wearing, making fortunes on Wall Street, et cetera. In America, it always goes in every generation a news cycle of reaction. And so, so I always believe be patient with young people. They figure it out over time. I'm less patient with people in positions of authority, especially in political power. And I think if I'm, for example, in academia, I have an extra responsibility to be careful. I know who my students are, what their issues are, and respect that. But if I'm going to be teaching a subject, I have to be free to discuss that subject without fear and without being attacked. And I need to be protected in my free speech, but responsible. So I know people who are teaching, for example, in the fields of sciences, in the medical field, for example, at our local university, which you are professors. Recently, that professor was told because of some racial sensitivity, he couldn't use some medical or scientific statistics. So basically he said, well, I can't talk about the subject if I can't be free to talk about those things. And so I think, there are dangerous lines you don't want to cross. Like if you're not educating future doctors and scientists about things they need to know, which are science, then you've crossed a line in sensitivity. Science has been used to promote so-called like scientific racism in the past. It's been used to justify discrimination against people, and it still can be exploited in that way. But we have to be very careful to protect knowledge from being covered up because of those sensitivities. In any case, it is actually very related to this subject. And so in Medina, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, established the Covenant of Medina, which was one of the first written constitutions on record, that it acknowledged freedom of religion for the non-Muslim Arabs, the Jews, and the Muslims, that each were citizens who had to support and protect the rights of the others, and that they couldn't use their relationship of tribe or religion or ethnicity to protect others from the law, that is, from the consequences of their own criminal behavior. So Muslims can't protect Muslims because they have violated the rights of a Jew and they're being put on trial, or vice versa. And so there was a real hope to establish a community based on those ideals. And it was continuously threatened to be torn asunder and destroyed by people who want to revive these hatreds. And so here in America, racism is something that any of us over 30 or 40, we experience on a daily basis. We know that that's a real thing. We saw that. We heard it. We know what comedy was considered a few years ago that's no longer considered comedy. All the jokes that I learned as a kid were basically against every ethnic group in America, basically. And that's funny. And at the same time, we were hurting people out of our ignorance. And so some nostalgia that people feel is simply a time when I was ignorant and wasn't aware that I'm doing harm to other people. And I am no longer ignorant. Back then, maybe I was naive. I was innocent. I didn't know what I was doing or saying. But now I'm not. Now I have a responsibility. At the same time, people and institutions can obviously explore where the limits are. But without real political leadership that's bipartisan, you can't solve these problems because there's no agreement on where the boundaries of free speech are, for example. And what's the difference between, for example, free speech in your place of worship and in the political sphere or in the marketplace? like if my religious belief, for example, in the marketplace, I mean in the mosque or in the church is pretty absolute. But do I have the right to discriminate against people because of my religion when I'm a business owner, for example? Or does a corporation have the right to have a set of religious values as a corporation and then use that as an excuse to discriminate against people? Those are things that, because of our current highly partisan charged atmosphere, we can't really explore as a society. And so it is a danger. And so Medina is a model, and it's also a warning, because it never was able to succeed because of real life matters to establish the kind of society that's envisioned in the Quran and in the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, because the real world keeps interrupting. And so that is ever the problem of human beings. And the fact that it's a hard conversation to have doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. And so we read these verses. We're not going to go back over them today. In their hearts is disease, fi qulubihim maradun, the diseases of the heart destroy our ability to act effectively, morally, and responsibly, because the diseases of the heart blind us to their way of justifying our bad decisions based on perceived wrongs, for example, or hurt feelings or emotions that we have that cause us to justify hatred and wickedness and evil choices that hurt other people. And it all comes back to hurt ourselves. And so what these verses are telling us is, to be a true Muslim, you have to struggle to purify your heart from these diseases, and that is racism and hatred, generalizing about people and justifying actions that harm others without a just cause, without giving them a presumption of innocence. So today we'll read the next verse, verse 11. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ أَلَا إِنَّهُمْ هُمَ الْمُفْسِدُونَ وَلَكِنْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. They're told, do not spread corruption in the land or upon the earth. You could translate it either way. They say, but we are muslihun. Muslihun, we are reformers. We are improving the society. Like every politician, of course, is there to make the country great. So they answer a criticism by, oh no, we're the opposite of that. In fact, it is they who are spreading corruption, but they do not perceive. They do not perceive it, la yash'urun. They can't feel it. And so, are you all right? So there are two words here that are so important from the beginning of the Quran. Islah, muslihun, which is reformers working for restoration of the earth in harmony with God's will. And so Islah means to fix what is broken. What is no longer whole, now it is broken, to repair. So to repair the fissures in society that cause division. And the opposite of that, ifsad, al-mufsidun, being referred to here in the Quran, is corruption. That is spreading division, hatred among people, corrupting morals and the ability to make sound decisions based on law and based on morality, but instead making decisions based on your own feelings or your own desires. And so nobody goes, Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, they all said, we're working to return the country to greatness. They didn't say, oh, we're here because we want to murder, rape, and pillage. No, they want to restore justice. Great injustices have been done to us. Now we have to bring back the greatness of our land and restore our pride and dignity as human beings, et cetera, et cetera. But all those folk, they're the cause of the problem. They have to be eliminated. And then we justify, genocide or justify racism or whatever on those criteria. There's no society in the world that hasn't gone through that. I challenge you, think of a country where it hasn't happened, that people have been harmed in the past. Now they take power and turn it against their former oppressors. And how many genocides since, let's not talk about 70 or 80 years ago. I mean, how many genocides have happened since that time? And a lot of times the genocide happened after the oppressed people are victorious in a revolution and turn against their former oppressors. And a lot of time, the minority group end up being the oppressor of the majority, or the former persecuted minority now become the dictators of countries. That's happening right now all over the world in different situations. So this is not something historic about a little mud village in Arabia 1400 years ago. It's about how to use divine law as a guideline in healing societies and removing sickness in the heart. And the sickness, if I pretend like, we were never racist in America. America's always been great. We were always the best. Manifest destiny. I can pretend that. And it would go good. It would go good with my feelings in a lot of ways. I don't want to admit that in the past we did wrong and we didn't make good decisions. But to be honest, if you can't look at yourself honestly, you're never going to treat anybody honestly either. If I can't even look at my past with fairness, how am I going to be fair to people who are totally different than me in their culture or race or religion? How am I going to be fair? Can't even be fair to my own history and my own experiences. And so that's what really this surah and this part of the surah is about. And so they don't say, no, we love being corrupt and evil. No, they say, no, we're doing Islah. We are reformers. We're trying to fix things. So couldn't Abdullah ibn Ubayd say that? I said, I was trying to reunite the people. Under my leadership, I was making peace. Now this guy comes and he spoils everything and he takes it all on himself. And of course, that's not to say he didn't do something good in his society. And maybe he could have been successful, nobody knows. But in fact, before he ever achieved his dream, the same people he claimed to be the leaders of, they saw something better and they went in that direction. Nobody forced it down their throats. They went and elected someone, chose someone freely to be their leader and to solve problems in their community. And that person was extremely successful and lived and died living not as a king in a palace, but in a mud hut, basically, as you would call it today, without guards, without an army, without even a wooden door in his house. And his successors after his death were similar to him in that way, very modest people. None of them took money from the public treasury. None of them paid themselves or their family and relatives, but they were really as close as you can be as human beings to selfless leaders. And so it wasn't like one corrupt leader of one party is replaced by another corrupt leader of another party, but there was a clear difference in the morality of the one and the other, and the lifestyle and appearance and dignified character and words and harmony of words and actions. And when you see leaders in the political sphere who have the characteristic of sincerity and mildness of manner, and who while may not be perfect in all ways, try to unite different factions in a community. That's a good thing and positive thing, and it's not always common. And so we can clearly see in our country the difference in leadership style of different leaders. And not always the people who are the most famous and charismatic, inspiring speakers and leaders are always the ones who are good for a society. And Allah knows best. And so it's fair to say that Abdullah bin Ubay may have had some good intention for his community, but his intentions were also mixed up with his own ego, his own desire. And that's true for a lot of human beings. You don't have to be the devil incarnate to be harmful in a leadership position in your community. And so that's why Allah said here, Innahum humal mufsidun. No, actually, it's not a matter of opinion. You can establish with clear evidence who is actually spreading corruption and instability in the community. وَلَكِنْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ, but they don't always realize it themselves. So the fact that huwa la yash'ur, means he may have some good intention and doesn't always know that he's doing things that are corrupt because he's following his hawa, his own desire. And sometimes it's hard for people to differentiate between what's right for me and what's right for everybody else. But, and so you hear a lot of speeches about him as, Ra's al-Munafiqeen, or the head of the hypocrites. And he was not the only one. And you need to, be clear about who he was and how dangerous he was. However, it's not like a cartoon where he was a cartoon villain who always appeared that way. In fact, he always appeared. If he were here right now, you wouldn't be able to distinguish between it. You would probably think he was better than all of us because he did know how to behave correctly. Yes, brother. Did you have something?
Oh, I have a question.
Yes.
So what I can to counter argue this, what are we supposed to say? Like if someone is in power, became a president, what is he supposed to say? He's supposed to, of course, he's gonna say, I'm here to improve.
Of course. Yeah, that's what it is. No leader, no matter how evil. So I only give the example of Hitler because like almost everybody in the world says like that's like the worst guy in the last 100 years or more. And so they pretend these leaders have to be either an angel or a devil. And so no leader claims they're, corrupting the earth. They all claim they're doing Islam. So it's not the word or the speech. You've got to examine what are the criteria. And so Islamic teaching, Sharia, codifies actual method of doing what we call istislah, which is reform in the society, finding, making political decisions or opinions, coming to opinions or policies that will produce an improvement of the society or the individual, and to avoid as much as possible harm or mufsada in the society, mufsada which would be a source of harm in the society or the individual. And so we have to analyze how it affects the individual, how it affects the family and the society as a whole, and then come with evidence. And so there's a basic rule is if we have a current status quo and we want to reform, we have to have clear evidence that our reform is going to improve that status quo. And it's going to mitigate harm, not transferring harm from one group to another group. But it has to overall lessen the harm for everybody, not maybe remove all harm for everybody. But it can't be simply exchange harm of one group to harm of another group. Nor can it be in the name of reform, simply removing one harm and replacing it with even a worse harm. And so there have to be ways of measuring practically the outcome of reforms. And too often what we do, like in a democratic society, is it's all based on rhetoric that's taken personally without objectively balancing the results. I'll give you an example from American history, which is very relevant to Medina, which we won't have time to talk about in too much detail tonight, but the Prohibition. So Prohibition happened in American history almost 100 years ago, a little bit less than 100 years ago now, and it happened in Medina. And in Medina, it actually had a lasting long-term success. In America, it was a disaster. Nobody tried to measure the effects that it would have on the society, basically overnight, changing people's behavior by force and criminalizing their behaviors. And it basically created the organized crime of the 20th century, which, is for the last 100 years, the major cost of American government, other than warfare, has been basically, organized criminal activity caused by irresponsible reform without using wisdom. And so a lot of people, when they talk about Islamic reform, will point to prohibition and show you how in Islam, these things happen gradually. And it was developed as a moral choice over time and embraced so that it lasted, and it's still very popular in many societies in the world till this day. So it's lasted, millennia. And so in America, it was an absolute failure. And so now we've decided that marijuana, okay, let's not analyze the danger of self-medication with marijuana and the fact that once you lift the prohibitions on that, then the movement's going to be to lift the prohibitions on pretty much every other recreational drug. And we have a bad history with self-medication in this country, and it's caused huge problems, social problems and financial problems that have harmed generations. And then we're going to wholesale just drop that. And so you go from one extreme to the other, and without a lot of science and a lot of good social studies of these things. And so I always think that Islamic principles of reform could work in any society, even without the Islam part, if you took those principles seriously. But it has to be, politics should be about policy. Policy should be measurable and objective criteria. And that's something that just doesn't happen, unfortunately. And that's why so many of these projects fail. So prohibition was a social project that failed. The prohibition of drugs, especially in the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s, seemingly failed. It did succeed in a lot of things, failed in other areas. And now we're going to probably go the opposite direction. And I would anticipate a mixture of good and evil coming from those choices, and Allah knows best. So anyway, what we're about in this chapter 2 of the Holy Quran, is talking about the founding of communities. You remember the first of the chapter talked about scripture and the word of God and the need of faith. And now it's talking about living faith in community and working to reform communities and what would be working models of community. And so we'll continue, inshallah, next week. May Allah Almighty bless you and your family and all of our community today and every day. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum.